Well, hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining in this continuing study as we are in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 14. And we left off last week in verse 6. And um, this is such a thrilling, exciting passage of scripture. Um, there's so much here, and we're going to take it a little slow just to show you what a beautiful miracle that God is doing in this story and try to apply it to our lives today. But first, as we, remember we left off in verse 6 that Jonathan had broken away from his father's army. Remember that Saul is king, and but of course Saul's influence and his connection with God didn't last very long because of just his headstrongness and how he took things into his own hands and did not wait for the Lord to work things out. And so we see here this next chapter and so forth will be very interesting to watch what happens in the life of Saul when he is technically out of favor of God, but yet he is still the king and still in charge, and he has not yet been replaced. And I find this just a very interesting dynamic because God's favor is not on him the way God wanted, but yet God still honors the position, honors him in charge of the people. And we need to look at this closely just to examine um, how God works through people and how he works through, we'll say, imperfect people, as we all are, those of us that make mistakes, those in leadership that make mistakes, trying to find where we, as we follow God and as we follow those that are put there by God to lead us, how do we interact? How do we behave? How do we handle things that appear to be um, just disturbing or challenging or difficult to understand, any number of words here. And so think about that as we look at what we're going to cover in the next few weeks here. So Jonathan is obviously in favor with God, being prompted by the Lord. And we saw last week that he feels something in his heart. Um, and so that he feels prompting, and so he leaves with his armor bearer. And of course, weaponry is in very short supply here. And but Jonathan seemed to have armor. He seemed to have a weapon and an armor bearer. So maybe they had two. Not quite sure the quantity of weapons they had here. We'll see it as we move on a little bit here. That would suggest that Jonathan didn't even carry a weapon as we know it, but his armor bearer did. And so watch that as we continue. So the armor bearer certainly was connected with Jonathan and on the same wavelength. And um, again, this looks like a suicide mission. Two guys going against a garrison of the Philistines. Um, there had to have been a strong reassurance there of what God was wanting to do. And of course, Jonathan seemed to have felt that, but also so did his armor bearer, which again, I think is quite interesting. The armor bearer doesn't have a name. We only hear about him little bits and pieces, but surely, at least in my understanding, the armor bearer is just as much have a relationship with God, wanting to do the will of God, following the man that God put into his life. And so, as Jonathan bears his heart out to what he wants to do, the armor bearer said to him, "Go do in your heart everything that's you want to do." And he's saying, "My heart is like your heart. My heart is in accordance with you." Here's where it gets interesting because the term "your heart," we use it all the time. We see it all through scriptures. But the challenge is what are they really talking about? And what do they mean? Um, Obviously, your heart is a organ that pumps blood. There is no um, intelligence in the heart, in the muscle. That's been proven by science. They obviously at this time did not know that. The medical industry was, or medical practice was very, very limited, and people did not live long lifestyles, long life expectancies, just because medicine wasn't there to promote that. And so their understanding is quite interesting, but yet it influenced our society so much that even today, 2,500, 3,500 years downstream from when this took place, we still refer to things of the heart. We still refer to the heart as though it's like the brain. Um, but yet, what are we speaking about? What did we talk about, and what are they talking about when they talk about the heart? Um, as we know it, because we are medically um, knowledgeable, we know science, we understand all the other types of um, practices that are there. We understand psychology. They know how the brain functions and how it controls our body. But yet, what we really speak about here in this verse 7 is it's the center of your emotions. It is the part of you that seems to guide you. And here is where we get it's very interesting because what comes from the center of our emotions can be either rational or very irrational. And in the Bible, when we read through things that are associated, concepts that are associated with the heart, we come across the myriad of different emotions: love, hatred, fear, courage, intention, understanding, thinkings, feelings. And then, just to even make it more challenging, we come across scriptures that say that the heart is deceitfully wicked and who can know it, and don't trust your heart. So, sometimes we're left in a little bit of a quandary here on what to do with these emotions that come upon us. And so that's why this is so interesting here is, there isn't anything that says that God spoke to him in a audible voice, that God put some handwriting on a rock or on a wall that told him what he should do. He just had something coming from his inner connection with God, the inner heart, if you will. Again, we use the word. I struggle to find even a different word to replace it because we're just so used to it, and we sort of know what it means. But I want you to think about that, the center of our emotion that guides us here. Sometimes we've been very tripped up by following the center of our emotions. Many people have gone into areas that have been very harmful for them because they've followed, we'll use the term, follow your gut, follow your heart, follow, don't, you can reason things out with your mind, but then sometimes your heart tells you to do one thing and your mind tells you to do other. And we struggle in most of our lives trying to make the right decisions based upon these things that come across, these emotions that come from us and in us and through us. And Jonathan, his armor bearer, are seeing that right now. And so as we go to verse 8, and again, we're looking at Bible Hub, so this will obviously show an interlinear with the Hebrew words, English translation. It reads from right to left. There's a phonetic pronunciation in blue, and then above it is a number, which are called the Strong's numbers, which allow you to click on it and come up with a lexicon or a dictionary form of the word and what it means. And then down below are the parts of speech. And they will allow us to, at least in this case, what's important is to see what's the intensity behind these words. Hebrew is a incredibly wonderful language to convey emotion. It is a poetic, romantic, emotional language. It is not a scientific language. And so when we read Hebrew, we're really focusing on the meaning of the feelings and the emotions behind it, the relationship portion of it, much more than we are trying to look at it from a scientific point of view. And that's something that has been impressed upon me as I study the Hebrew, that I'm laying aside much of the investigation like I used to do that was based upon the science of it, the mathematics of it, the trying to dig into the finer points of, scientifically, how could this be? medically and all of those things. And I'm realizing the Hebrew language just does not give you enough information to look and analyze the scriptures that way. That it's intended to look at it from an emotional standpoint, to look at the feelings of it, the relationship of it, and mainly the relationship between people and the relationship between people and God. And so that's been a little bit of a tough one for me to shift into that mode. And so here we see Jonathan and his armor bearer are like-minded. They're of the same heart, and so now they're setting up kind of a scheme here, a plan to find out, is what I'm planning to do here, is this sanctioned by God? Is this something that God gave to me to do, impressed upon my heart, or is this just my own zealousness? Again, we struggle with this. Some of us have harder times than others because some of us are very outgoing, very zealous, very gung-ho, that we want to do, and conquer, conquer, conquer. Others of us are very timid and very reserved, and we struggle to step out in areas that we are unsure of. And so Jonathan here is trying to find out, okay, where am I in this mixture of feelings that I'm going through? And how do I know that God will be with us? Or else, if he's not, we're just going to go up and, this is a suicide mission. Basically, we're going to die because there's 20 of them and there's only two of us. And remember from last week's lesson to describe the conditions there, that they're in a garrison outpost. They're on a high hill with sharp, jagged rocks all around. And Jonathan and his armor bearer are down at the bottom, and they're up above. They can shoot at them, drop stones on them. Total disadvantage for Jonathan and his armor bearer because these 20 Philistines are up in a very protected, like a crow's nest up there. And so this is interesting. He wants to definitely know that God is with him. So he's trying to seek direction. And so he says, well, I know what we're going to, he's feeling this in his heart, and we see it playing out, that he's going to go and come out in a place where they can show themselves to the Philistines and start some conversation. And so we go to verse 9. And Jonathan is saying to his armor bearer, okay, there's, really only two things that are possible, maybe three things possible to happen here. First, we can each meet in the middle. We could wait where we are, and they could come to us, or we could go up to them. And so Jonathan doesn't think meeting in the middle is anything that's possible, because he doesn't even offer it as an option. But he feels that, you know, there are two things that are possible. So he says, if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and not go up to them. Um, this would be the Philistines taking the biggest risk. They would be leaving their protected place where they have been holed up, where their fortress, and coming down to what could possibly be an ambush. They don't know if there's more than two Israelites there. Uh, They wouldn't do this. I mean, this would be foolish. There's no reason for them to come down. And so, but this is one thing that's possible. And so Jonathan says, if they say to us, we'll come down and come after you, then Jonathan's kind of saying the deal's off. This is not of God. This isn't going to work. And so we look to verse 10, and the other flip side of this is, but Jonathan says, but if they say, come up to us, then we will go up to them, and we will know that uh, God, and again, using the word Yahweh, which is again, very interesting, because as we've talked in previous lessons, Elohim is the masculine side of God, the delivering, the powerful warrior, conquer the enemies, I'll take care of you, protector, provider. And Yahweh is the side of God that shows the mercy and compassion. And so it's interesting that they chose, the choice of word here of what Jonathan was trusting in. He was trusting in the mercies of God in a way that maybe we don't see in some of the other verses where they talk about God fighting the battles for them. So again, this is significant and very interesting. So basically, he says, if they say, "Come up to us," this will be a sign, and we'll know that God has delivered them. Yahweh has delivered them into our hands. This took a lot of faith on the side of the armor bearer, and it took a lot of faith on the side of Jonathan. How did he know? How was this so sure in his heart that this was the will of God? Because now they were going to have to climb and scale this cragged um, outpost where the Philistines outnumber them 20 people to 2 people, so 10 to 1 outnumbering, and make themselves vulnerable to the Philistines just shooting arrows down at them, dropping rocks on them. And so verse 11 says, here's what happens. They showed themselves to the Philistines, and of course, the Philistines actually mock them. They ridicule them and say, "Oh, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes. It's like the rats are coming out of the ground," all those derogatory terms that sometimes are used, and they're making fun of the Hebrews. Um, and so verse 12 goes on, and then called the Philistine garrison, the men they called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come on up here, we're going to show you a thing or two." Interesting that they use similar um, colloquialisms to what we use. How many times people use that and say, "Here, let me show you something. I'm going to show you how it really is. Let me teach you a lesson." This is the kind of vernacular they're using here, and said, "Show, come." And we will show you a thing or two. But of course, to Jonathan, his armor bearer, this was the sign that they were looking for. This was the um, indication that God was going to do something wonderful in their um, in their midst here, and God was going to deliver them into their hands. Um, Again, this is really hard to comprehend. If I can picture, the Philistines in their tower, protected, and a sheer rock face of craggy rocks. And Jonathan, the armor bearer, would have to go up. And we see that really being portrayed when we look at verse 13, that Jonathan climbs on his hands. The word knees here is not a good translation, because the word raglav is feet. Regel is the word for foot. So he was not climbing on his hands and knees. He was going hand and foot and climbing up a rock face that obviously they didn't need climbing gear like we would see people climb rocks today, but it was sharp enough that he wasn't on his knees. He was on his hands and feet. And Jonathan went first, and his armor bearer went after him. Again, trying to picture what this looked like, that Jonathan was out front with no armor bearer protecting him. You would think, at least from what we've seen in other biblical narratives, especially the story of David fighting the Goliath, that Goliath's armor bearer went before him and was kind of like the first line of defense, kind of a shield, human shield in front of him. And Jonathan didn't put his armor bearer before him, which would have been the tactical best way to handle this. The armor bearer went after him, and they climbed up this sheer rock face. And it says that these 20 men somehow fell before Jonathan, and Jonathan didn't kill them. He fought them hand to hand combat. And then once they were wounded and knocked down, then the armor bearer, who bore the sword, was protected by the armor, killed them. And again, looking at this word memowet is in a PL form, which means it's a very intense. This was not just a haphazard, this was intense battle that was going on here. And the armor bearer helped and finished off this exchange of fighting that they were in. And so we're going to get to verse 14 and stop after that, because it just gets so incredible as we move on from here. And I don't want you to get too much information, because next week this is going to be so incredible to see how some of the details of this battle. And so to finish up, this is verse 14. This was the slaughter which was first made by Jonathan and his armor bearer, and about 20 men. And it gives a kind of a unique description of the place where the battle took place in. Now, of course, it says acre here. That is not a term that was used back in biblical times. It really says this word acre is mana'ah, which is the size of a field. And so they're saying that about half the size of a field, which we have no idea how big a field was back then, but we know that they plowed with animals. So these were not 40-acre farms. This was not a huge area. This was really a small area, like maybe the size of less the size of a house lot. So a very small area that these men were in. And it's interesting that the biblical narrative finds it important to list the size of the battle of where it took place. But what we know, putting all these pieces together, is this was rocky hillside. There was not a lot of open area. The area that they fought in, that they were um, holed up in, was very small. And in this area, Jonathan and his armor bearer defeated an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. And God worked an incredible miracle in this battle. And next week, we're going to find out just how incredible it really was. So I thank you for listening to this message. I just pray that God's word will richly bless you and encourage you, and you can see and feel a little bit here of the way God speaks to our hearts, how he spoke to Jonathan's heart. And maybe that will resonate with some of you, maybe it won't. It does with me, and I pray that you will know how much God loves you and cares about you, and how much he desires to talk to us and have a relationship with us. So you have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful week, and Lord's willing, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.